Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jason Mellon. I'm the director of the Center for Texas Music History. I want to start out by thanking all of you for coming, as well as all of our gracious hosts who made today possible. John McCarty Gonzalez and Tammy Gonzalez of the Center for the Study of the Southwest, my colleagues in the Center for Texas Music History, Avery Armstrong and Alan Schaefer, our friends at the Whitlock Collections, Hector Saldana and Dave Saltzman. But the reason that we are here is I want to welcome Dr. Tara Lopez. She is assistant professor of ethnic studies at Winona State University in Minnesota. Her doctorate in sociology is from the University of Manchester. From the University of Manchester, which informed the work of her first book, Winter of Discontent, Myth, Memory, and History on the English strike wave of the late 1970s. But the topic that we'll be looking at today is one that she first encountered in her home state of New Mexico, where she keyed into her neighbors of the El Paso punk scene, where the subject of her upcoming current book, Chucotan Soundtrack, El Paso Punk, was coming from the University of Texas Press Mexican Union. Some of the early versions of that research appeared in an article, appeared in our own journal, Texas Music History. We have issues of those available for the taking up on the table on the side, should you need them. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Tara Lopez.
Muy buenas tardes, yo soy Tara López y es un gran honor estar acá en esas tierras indígenas tan lindas de Texas State, San Marcos. Hi, I'm Dr. Tara Lopez. It's really a pleasure to be speaking with you all on these indigenous ancestral lands that form the foundation of this absolutely stunning campus. I didn't know Central Texas was so beautiful, so thank you. Before I start, I really want to thank the Center for Texas Music History, in particular, Dr. Jason Mellon, Avery Armstrong, and Adam Clark. I almost called him Alan. And you, the audience, either those of you who are here in person or those of you who are logging in virtually. I do want to thank the university I teach at, the Winona State University in Minnesota, who has provided not only the financial support, but also just like the intellectual encouragement to continue my writing and my research on what I consider a very important topic. And finally, I have to thank all my punks, all the punks in El Paso, for sharing their stories, their time, and their carefully curated personal collections of photos, almost all of which that you're going to see today are theirs, that they have generously shared with me. And also their flyers and their zines that are also, you're going to see excerpts of them as well. And this is a shout out to those. I love you, Chupo. So you know that I have your back in. So what we're going to do is see these wonderful photos and listen to some of these stories in my presentation today, Architects of Sound, the Women of El Paso Punk. There we go. Thank you. It's such a wonderful, wonderful picture. So 2 notes on terminology. When I'm referring to women, I'm not using it as in any way a reference to an identity assigned at birth, but rather these are the identities that my interviewees shared with me. So there's no assumption about biology or gender identity. Second of all, this is a punk community that's predominantly of color. It's predominantly Mexican American. Most of my interviewees would identify as quote unquote Mexican, but it's really important to emphasize that they are Mexican American because this is part of American history. We are part of American history. However, many of them use Chicana, and to be precise and concise, I'm going to just use Chicana. Okay, so we got the terminology, we're getting all excited. Let's go. Oops, and I have to choose this. There we go. Okay. So El Paso appears to be an unlikely place for a punk rock revolution. But for a little girl, this one, growing up in southern New Mexico, everything special and unique has always been associated with this city in West Texas. At Valverde Mobile Home Park, which is in Doñana, the small town of Doñana, north of Las Cruces, if the sole swing set in the middle of the park was not mobbed by the big kids, I would run out there and wiggle on to a swing. My hope was to propel my short, sturdy legs, as you see, sturdy legs, high enough to see beyond the trailer park. Although it was obviously an impossible dream, especially for a little toddler that you see here, I thought I might get a glimpse of the surrounding desert, the skyrise of nearby Las Cruces, or even the El Paso. My father, there he is, there's Carlos, my father, was and really always is talking about. Although my father's family is from the northern New Mexican town of Paso, New Mexico, right close to the Colorado border, my father spoke and continues to speak much more lovingly of southern New Mexico, and always including El Paso as part of southern New Mexico, as many Mexicans do. My father's very educated, and he's neither oblivious of geography nor history. But for him, when he was commenting about the research that he's a bit befuddled by, because it's not punk rock, he said, well, no, Tara, quote, El Paso just fits in culturally and really needs to come back to New Mexico, unquote. And I know that's pretty daring saying this right in the middle of Texas, but it's so true. It's as if a bitter romance is embedded in our collective memory, with the resentment of Texas's claim of New Mexico's largest settlement in the 19th century. El Paso, therefore, has been omnipresent in my life, and forging an emotional proximity to the city that continues to endure. An emotional proximity that only compares to my emotional proximity to punk rock. Punk rock is a blitzkrieg of sound that has shattered musical convention and really broadened participation in music. Sociologist Nick Crossley vigorously summed it up, quote, punk made music matter. Punk was a catalyst, battering a hole in the walls of the popular music world, creating opportunities and encouraging widespread participation, unquote. Punk rock mattered to me and my sister too. So once we moved up to the big city, so we were left with the big city of Albuquerque, there were plenty of punk venues to satiate our young appetites. However, I eventually burrowed myself into academics and emerged as myself. Punk rock, and therefore punk rock, also continued to shape me emotionally and became the focus of my work. So therefore, based not only on my academic research, but also a visceral certainty that I have always known that El Paso and punk are the most likely of pairings. While punk is known for its daring subversion, so too is El Paso. Indeed, in the 19th century, El Paso's criminal reputation, or reputation as a criminal outpost, was so widely known that its nickname soon became Chuco, which is a derivation of the Spanish word for crooked or illegal, so the sin city of the time. Therefore, El Paso is the natural staging site for the punk revolution that I'm going to share with you today. So just imagine we're in a very different part of Texas, but on the horizon of the Franklin Mountains. And in their shadow is this rich history of a city that has nourished the songs, bands, zines, flyers, sometimes riots, etc., that these amazing punks, especially these women, worked out of history, inequality, struggle, community, and most importantly, love. With our tournament set, we're on our way to Chicanas. In an interview with me in 2021, Barbara Ann Welsh, aka Barbara Welsh, explained, quote, hey, I'm going to make a t-shirt. It's going to be El Paso. And underneath, it's going to be EP, Endless Possibility. And I totally believe that about El Paso. I believe that when I came here, I have always believed. As a woman involved in the El Paso punk community since the 1970s, the city and also punk rock delivered unfettered avenues of freedom, from expression to organization to simply just enjoyment for these young women in the city. However, this optimism runs up against the data on women's participation in mainstream. So for instance, the USC Annenberg Inclusion Initiative found in a study of 900 popular songs from 2012 to 2020, that male artists outnumbered female artists 3.6 to 1. Moreover, not only did females make up only about 21.6% of solo artists, on the production side, the disparities were even more stark. The ratio of male to female producers was 38 to 1. Now, while these are studies of mainstream artists, those of you who are familiar with music history or the sociology of popular culture, the topic of women's representation in a variety of music cultures is something that is equally fraught. If Sarah Cohen sees women as, quote, present yet absent, unquote, in rock music, and Oliver Wong sees women as, quote, everywhere but the center, unquote, in Northern California Filipino American DJ music, you see something different in El Paso. So the women involved in Chuco Punk reveal their ever-present role throughout this music community. Welsh and her counterparts, that's by a very body Welsh, and so really the important thing to note, aside from this technical pickup that I made, is that Welsh was and other Punqueras like her were everywhere, just like gravity, like the air. They were ever present, and not only ever present, they were elemental and foundational to this punk community. Oh, okay, this. So today's talk is going to nuance not only your understanding about this amazing city in West Texas and also the punk rock that emerged out of there, but also challenge our understandings of women's roles in just music as a whole, but my particular focus obviously is punk rock music. So here before you, you have a slide with the photo of that beautiful city, there's Chuco. You see my sources, but really the important sources that we're going to focus on today are the 70 in-depth interviews that I completed with El Paso punks, or oral histories. Now what you see is that 18 of these interviews are with women. So you're going to be like, hey, Lopez, so what are you going to disprove, right? Like the number of women that you interviewed was in the minority, it is in the minority. Well, the number of women interviewed is indeed in the minority in my research. All we need to do to understand the presence of women in any music culture is to widen the aperture. And their omnipresence, in this case, in Chuco punk, will become apparent. So one helpful theoretical tool is from Nick Crossley, who's a sociologist from the University of Manchester, UK. And for him, instead of using the term music scene, he pivots to music worlds. And he's borrowing from the concept of Howard Becker, who's a sociologist, who argued that art, it's not art scenes, but he sees art as a form of collective action. So borrowing from that, Crossley states, well, then we need to use that collective action framework to understand music cultures as well, because they are art as well. And so with this music world, we can see a focus on musicians, roadies, promoters, and others providing a much more expansive and inclusive understanding of these communities centered around music. Therefore, from my research, even though sometimes the word, or this, even today, the word scene comes up, I use it in common parlance. For my academics, it's really helpful because that is what all the interviews use, even though they use music scenes. Music World allows us to see the women involved in booking the shows, or the granitas hiding the money from a show that's about to get busted from the cops, in the walls, in the techo, the roof, and so forth, or cooking for the bands at the shows. So then if you see Music Worlds, those women are just as foundational to this punk rock scene. Moreover, well, in this specific presentation, it's going to be about half and half. It's really important to note that this music community was predominantly of color. And in particular, this was a Chicano-dominated punk rock community. So the work of Michelle Adel Fayan really deepens our understanding of punk rock in her work called Locomotion, The Travels of Chicana and Latina Popular Culture, in her account of Los Angeles punk rock. She argued in her book, quote, mainstream representations of punk represent punk culture as a white boy only fad. In fact, punk had various and competing strains. It was not one thing, unquote. So what you're going to see is one of those strains. And these women of El Paso, of Chuco, shape punk rock in their own image. And I'm going to show it in 3 ways, because 3 is a magic number, right? On the stage, behind the scenes, and in the crowd. So let me show you how. Oh, all right. Thank you for that. Please stand. Sonic intermission. Really loud. Yay. Okay, so it's really hard to follow Jimmy. Okay. So at a 2002 show in Minot, North Dakota, Jenny Cisneros, that awesome woman was lead singing in that little show. She was bellowing into the mic as the rest of the band that she was part of, Spitch, is in a frenetic trance, and the audience in the throes of delightful upheaval. Cisneros, again, this picture here in the white little band, is howling into the microphone. She revealed to me in one of the interviews, quote, that Minot show was probably the best in my books, one of the best shows we've ever done, hands down. Which is crazy because Minot, North Dakota, is such a tiny little town that's near the Canadian border. They had the most energy I've ever seen at a show, and it's almost like the kids came from every other little town from around Minot too. It was just fucking awesome. I mean, it was just like nonstop, just pure energy for however long the set was, and those kids were so into it, like I've never seen, unquote. But the thing that she's missing from that part of the interview is that she was the spark in that fire. You can't see that crowd without her and the rest of the band, but particularly her, howling into that microphone. So Cisneros started out as a 14-year-old self-confessed quote-unquote weirdo at Bel Air High School, which is in the lower valley of El Paso. And she really was drawn to female-fronted bands like Nausea, Bikini Kill, and Anti-Schism, along with a mix of Susan and the Banshees and Sisters of Mercy. But she was also drawn to a politics in a punk community of equality and peace, and which inspired her once her friend Alex Martinez asked her to front a hardcore band to really become foundational to the hardcore scene in El Paso and found the band Spitch. So Spitch really became just super popular, not only in El Paso, but as they started to tour, as you can see right there from Minot, they just spread their tentacles everywhere and they inspired this punk rock love. And you have to think, those of you who aren't familiar, or if you were familiar with this is before the era of social media. So many of these punks relied on zines, and one of the key zines, especially for these El Paso punks, was Book Your Own Self-Demise. Right, so it's a key zine. I'm not using these bad words, like that was the name of it, right? You can look it up. To set up shows, to connect with other punks in places like Minot, or in Austin, or in Albuquerque. And so in 1995, when Spitch was really in their prime, they appeared in this long list. So when you book your own fucking life, they would have all these different lists of bands by state, right? And so in the list of 40 other Texas bands in 1995, and these advertisements for each band are about a half an inch, describing themselves. Stitch described themselves as pissed out, brutal, female, male vocals with a lot of attitude, spit, unquote. Which you can see, like that's pretty much Stitch. This one, thank you. However, just a mere 6 years later, Jenny Cisneros was howling into the microphone on the cover of Maximum Rock and Roll, another key zine that was pretty much closely tied to Book Your Own Fucking Life. Bringing all that spunky and snarky energy that they put into all the ads in Book Your Own Fucking Life, and then all of a sudden it becomes full circle and the lead singer Stitch makes the cover of Maximum Rock and Roll. By this time, Stitch had moved to Austin, and they were no longer with Alex Martinez, but they were still the entire band was from El Paso, even though they had relocated closer to here. When asked about the Austin scene in this issue of Maximum Rock and Roll, because there's an interview part, Jenny Cisneros never forgets her roots. She does a very powerful shout out to Chupo. She states, quote, "There's actually a quite cool little scene in El Paso. And since I'm from there, I gotta give props to my homies," unquote. So even though she ventured out to this part of Texas, she always knew and continues to know where her roots are. So within the same music orbit as Jenny Cisneros were Sarah Reiser and Laura Beard. Laura Beard is this picture here. In their bands like Rope, the Glitter Girls, and later the Fall on Deaf Ears, Beard and Reiser had become a formidable force in music, but also in zine production and writing. Along with their friend Leah Lloyd, Reiser and Beard also found a platform to express their views outside of music in zine making, and indeed the name of their key zine was Ben Fatal. These three punks took a focused attack not only on the punk rock music world, but also on sexism. So if you see here, on the right, so there's Laura Beard, and she's actually playing this one from the Glitter Girls. This is an excerpt that I'm going to read from the zine, and you can get a sense of like what was of concern for her in particular in the punk rock scene. Quote, "I have yet to see any girl bands in El Paso. However, at shows, I see crowds of girls who really seem to be enjoying the music. Anyways, there seems to be a large number of girls attending the shows with such interest. I just can't understand why those girls don't get out there and play music. When it comes to playing an instrument, all it takes is a little dedication and willingness. And I'm sure that there are a lot of girls with killer voices, yet all the talent is hidden somewhere in the crowd. I hope to encourage you girls to get out there and get practicing. I'd be more than willing to help you girls out with equipment or anything else. Let's not be the majority of the crowds and the minority when it comes to playing music," unquote. Reiser brings a focus, so this is Sarah Reiser, one of her partners in crime, who brings the focus on broader forms of sexist oppression in her more typewritten out expression, which is great to just compare and contrast the cursive with the typewriter. Reiser wrote, "Some people say that the oppression of women no longer exists, but it does. As women, we are given so many standards and so many ideals to live by. Of course, it is our decision whether we fit the description or whether we decided to be who we are, freely discarding what is expected, what can often be overwhelming and tiresome," unquote. And again, this is in 1996. But in addition to their awesome writing, they had some really great music. So what you're going to hear are two of their songs. And again, the great thing about studying punk rock is like the songs are so short, so I can just play a whole bunch of music in a little bit of time. But for me, how I see punk, because I'm not a music journalist, but their music is all like just flagrantly disregarded sexism with really a Bratmobile, maybe even Fuzzy Bear-esque zeal, which we can hear in the sonic intermission. I know you really all wanted to like that. Come on, I know, it's fun. Such a fun band. And we could probably listen to all of it in 20 minutes. It's a fun rock. Okay, but they're to put on shows like for Jenny Cisneros or Laura Beer or Sarah Reiser, you had to have a network of people to really stage the shows and bring the audience to the shows. And many of these people were women. So, well, a lot of my research is on the 90s, and Cisneros and Reiser and Beard were primarily in the 90s part of the scene. But even before that, there was a major architect of sound, and that was Bobby Welsh. So Welsh is part of a military family and had spent the early part of her life abroad before moving to El Paso at the age of 16. However, that was at the end of the 70s, right? So we know that punk rock is emerging throughout the world at the time. So she immediately immersed herself in the sound and the sense of belonging that she said was quote unquote percolating at the time. She played guitar in a couple of bands, which I'm sure she's not going to like that I mentioned, but she did, and that's important. But she was also helping, what she calls schlepping, or just helping live her friends play live shows and setting up the sound for her friends in bands like Teenage Popeye. And indeed, she produced and helped release the first Teenage Popeye album, little LP, right? So that was her, Barbara Ann Welsh. If you find it, and she actually gave me a copy the other day. So again, there you have like production when we were also in production. But even though she was key to producing that first teenage pop by Modern Problems, actually EP, what she's known for is promoting. So after finishing her degree in philosophy at the University of Texas at Paso, her first real job after like helping out with these like informal like punk rock shows that were in backyards and sometimes at dry riverbeds between Juarez and then Paso, she started working for a new business called Ticketmaster that was emerging from Albuquerque, New Mexico. The second Ticketmaster office was actually in El Paso, where Welsh cut her teeth on the dynamics of the formal music business. She recounts how she had been helping out with local shows. So when she applied for the Ticketmaster show, she started answering phones and selling tickets for the fledgling business and soon became a central point person for music and events in the region. She immediately came to the attention of the El Paso Times, which this is where you see this awesome picture of her. And the name of the article was called, quote unquote, Body Tickets El Paso, and was the focus of one of the key features in the El Paso Times in 1983. Donning, I would say, this might be controversial, a very Susie Sue and the Banshees meets Joan Jett look. Her photo accompanied an account of Welsh leading this upstart business called Ticketmaster while helping to bring major events to the area at the age of 26. Nevertheless, simultaneously, while finishing her degree in philosophy, becoming a major force in Ticketmaster, she also was keeping her toes in the growing and up-and-coming punk rock music world in El Paso. Bonnie Welsh, along with local promoters Mike Jennings and Joe Dorgan, successfully applied for the nonprofit status for the creation of a key venue called Sound Seas, a transformative local punk alternative venue in El Paso. So anybody, especially from the first generation, sometimes the second generation of punks, like 70s, 80s, and even the early 90s, most all of them, at least in some way, went to Sound Seas. But first of all, they were very innovative because they wrote a grant to obtain nonprofit status for Sound Seas, and also Welsh was the treasurer of Sound Seas. Welsh reflects that when she first started getting involved in music in the late 1970s, quote, "We were really breaking ground. Punk wasn't even punk then," unquote. However, less than a decade later, she had already become instrumental in moving punk in her city by becoming one of the most notable and indeed formidable, and obviously, as you can see, energetic, she just doesn't stop, promoters in the entire region. In 1987, in another feature in the El Paso Times in 1987, Welsh admitted that she would eventually leave El Paso for greener pastures like San Francisco. She stated, quote, "But I've seen so many people put blood on the line to make El Paso a better place that I'd like to continue the effort," unquote. So despite her desire for greener pastures, she was no longer the wide-eyed punk rock girl that she used to be. And in 1992, she was the first major promoter to bring a concert to UTEP Sunville. Now, the lineup for the show in 1992 is enviable and should send shivers down any music lover's spine. The show that she brought, the first show, to El Paso, UTEP, University of Texas El Paso's Sunville, was U2, and who was opening for them? Public Enemy and the Sugar Cubes. And just a little side note, Welsh never left El Paso. I just saw her this week. So this live music fire that really Welsh, among others, but she spearheaded it, that she lit in like the 70s, 80s, and she's still doing today, was continued in the 1990s. And even in the late 1970s, 80s, there were backyard shows. But in the 1990s, backyard shows, especially in the Lower Valley, and if you're not familiar with the Lower Valley or the different parts of El Paso, like the South, southeast part of El Paso. That's where the sound was. Here come the picas. Erica Ortegon's little nephew screamed as throngs of punks charged into her backyard for yet another show. In her lower valley backyard, sorry about that. You would see, and this is actually in her backyard, right? She would have another show, a punk show, in her backyard. And Lower Valley backyard shows composed just one point, and her backyard in particular just composed one point in an entire constellation of shows that were occurring in El Paso, especially during the 1990s. So this is her era. She's more 1990s. This is Erica Ortegon here. For those of you on Zoom, central, like a central gal with glasses like me. And then on the left, awesome gal next to the guy on the right side, that's me, Dia Hernandez. And it's important to note both of those gals because they're partners in crime as well. Erica Ortegon's backyard became so important to the punk rock music culture, music world at this time that it became known as simply the Arboleda House. So the Arboleda House was the epitome not only of do-it-yourself punk rock ethos, but also the Mexican tradition of rascuache. According to Michelle Abed Fayan, in her work on Los Angeles punk, she argues, quote, the DIY punk values found resonance in the practice of rascuache, a Chicano cultural practice of making do with limited resources, unquote. And for Ortegon, her backyard and the extension cord that connected the band to the electricity is the essence of rascuache. So in the backyard, the bands are playing, and what she would have to do is connect that extension cord through her mother's bedroom window, and then you would have to connect it to her mother's bedroom wall. But she had her friend Lydia Hernandez, so she's got this. However, she unfortunately left the connection of the cord to someone else once. And instead of connecting the cord to the bedroom wall, they connected it to the bathroom. And so Ortegon explained in one interview, one of many interviews, quote, so the band would be playing and everyone's getting excited, and someone would use the bathroom or turn up the light, and then the music would just stop in the backyard. Yeah. She and her co-organizer, Lydia Hernandez, not only had to improvise, obviously, as you can tell, to constantly ensure that the show would go on, but they also had to keep that punk wildfire and misbehavior contained within the backyard, a task that did not always prove successful. Whether it was a guy at the show going around with a knife and slashing tires on the neighbors' parked cars all along Arboleda Drive, cannot confirm he was at the show, but there's suspicion that he was. Or the family getting fined $200, and again, this is in the 90s, and the Lower Valley is predominantly working class. They got fined for a particularly loud show. Nevertheless, Ortegon could always rely on the punk community to have her back. So what she did was, you see on your left, is an excerpt from her friend Lydia Hernandez's zine, Candy from Strangers. And she staged a show so she could get money to pay for that $200 fine. And she really tugged at the heartstrings of her fellow punks. She stated, quote, just remember, quote, all the good times, the Winona Riders, Hickey, Bristol, zine distribution, all the locals, the juice, the flat tires. Well, she was able to continue for a while. It was just important enough that they did do this, along with others in the Lower Valley, and along with other women in the Lower Valley and other parts of El Paso, staging shows, especially in their backyards. But there had to be a crowd. You don't have a show without a crowd. I don't know how to talk about this in my audience, right? So we have to see who's in the crowd. So this is where Crossley's concept of music roles becomes especially helpful in understanding how live music culture in El Paso really blossomed, especially in the backyards, especially in the Lower Valley that is predominantly Chicana. In the crowds at these shows were vast networks of mothers, hermanitas, cousins, tias, aunts, and comadres, along with committed quote-unquote fangirls that were key and essential to building this music world in El Paso. Case in point, I'll give you a little story, share this story. So this is in the early 1990s. And then in the early 1990s, Omar Rodriguez Lopez's main local band in El Paso was this band called Jerk. And his friend, Ernesto Ibarra, wanted to put Ibarra's newly minted local punk rock label, Yucky Bus, to work. So Ibarra's band, BBF, and I will not tell you today what that stands for, BBF and Jerk, decided to make a split tape called To Make Money at the end of 1993. But you can't just make a split tape and not have a massive show. So in early 1994, they organized this massive record release show where for the first 50 chunks that paid $4 to come in, they would get not only the free split tape, they would also get a comic book. And so they were all surging into Sergio Mendoza's backyard in the Lower Valley. This is where this big show was occurring, where you had a variety of bands, not just BBF and not just Jerk. You had a variety of bands playing at the time. And not only that, Mendoza's mom was selling burritos and nachos to all those hungry punks. And she was selling it, so you were making bank. So by the end of the night, they had earned approximately $900. And they were hoping to use that money so BBF could afford to go on tour, because BBF was already really active at this time throughout the United States, even though it was a local El Paso band. However, after the band stopped playing, somebody had called the cops, and 2 El Paso Police Department helicopters and 20 cop cars descended upon the house. Sergio Mendoza's mother knew that the money from the show would be lost to the cops. So, as Sergio, or AKA Serge, describes, there were panels. There was a type of roof where you have panels, right? You could push. So she pushed the panel aside, got the $900, hid it in the roof, covered the roof, and then the cops came in because she didn't want her kids losing their money. And literally, thanks to Mrs. Mendoza, the show could go on and BBF was able to tour. So not only does this show how instrumental women like Mrs. Mendoza and others were to allowing punk to flourish, but it also shows that there were tons of punks in that crowd paying that little cover fee to get in, right? So it's also important to understand that many of them were girls in the audience. So while often dismissed as passive recipients of sound or the more salacious attribute of quote-unquote groupies, the survival of punk shows anywhere, but in particular in El Paso, was dependent on the crowds of girls at the shows. However, it is necessary to reassess what such fangirls, quote-unquote fangirls, were doing, and music critic Jessica Hopper does an excellent job when she writes, quote, suggestion, replace the word fangirl with expert and see what happens. So I'll show you what happens. One of the experts in the crowd was Sonaí Perez. So she's almost like third generation punk, because she started school at Riverside High School, which is also Lower Valley, in 1999. She started going to punk rock shows when many of the bands like Spitch had already moved to places like Austin. But she did indeed have a deep commitment and love of punk rock and continues to do so. So after her cousins from Los Angeles brought Dead Kennedy's albums to play for her, and a brother who had her work alongside him at a radio station, punk was elemental. It was an elemental home for Perez. Punk shows became, quote, a place to just connect with other people that identified with you. But also it allowed us to just see people performing them in an experimental way that just wasn't the norm, unquote. Perez's deep background in punk, but also her quest for connection, reveals the experience of many women that I interviewed in my research. They went to the shows for sound, connection, and meaning. define the flippant assertions that their presence was merely decorative or superficial. And Perez was just one of many music experts at that time. Just ask Erica Ortegon or Lindia Mendez about what rare obscure EP was released in 1995 or whatever. They'll probably give you 7 answers to. So what's this all about? Okay. So get to my conclusion. Okay. The drive from Austin to El Paso is an arduous one. Although tied like an umbilical cord musically, the 575 miles of geographic distance makes this a long and exhausting trek. For Sarah Reiser and Laura Beard, this route was a familiar one. By 1997, El Paso could no longer contain Chuco Punk's energy as the bands intensified their touring throughout the US. Many were uprooting and moving to cities like Albuquerque, Oakland, and Austin, where Reiser and Beard were visiting friends in late March 1997. So by March 23rd, it was then time for the 2 young punks from Rope and Little Girls and the Fall on Deaf Ears to head back home with another one of their friends. They jumped into their Nissan pickup and merged onto I-10, heading west for home. At approximately 7:09, the driver fell asleep at the wheel, drifting into the left lane of the freeway, a little more than 30 miles east from El Paso. After the driver overcorrected, the pickup rolled over and Reiser and Beard were thrown from the vehicle and killed. At the drive-in, song Napoleon Solo has become the Syrian tribute in the aftermath of this profound tragedy. However, inadvertently evolving into lyrical synecdoche for the vitality and dynamism of Reiser's and Beard's lives. And this is why, for those of you who were expecting me to talk about the Margota and at the drive-in way before, that's why I'm talking about them at the tail end of my presentation. While all amazing and socially committed artists, meaning at the drive-in, Sparta and Margota, like with other music communities, journalists and scholars, like I've done myself in my first article on this music world, focus on the bands that came to national attention, and that process is very gendered, it's racialized, and classed. And then the entire community, and more often than not, the women, are resigned to the outskirts, resigned to the shadows of our attention when we're understanding music and music community. Black music critic and poet Henry Durkee calls these places the outskirts of punk. In his essay, I Wasn't Brought Here, I Was Born, Surviving Punk Rock, Long Enough to Find Afro-Punk, Durkee writes, quote, I think about what it takes to build a brotherhood in any space. Who sits at the outskirts while the brotherhood dances oblivious and heavy at the top? In the punk landscape, we are often given imagery that reflects the most real truths of this scene. The exclusion of people of color, of women, of the queer community, and that exclusion being sometimes explicit, sometimes violent, but almost always in direct conflict with the idea of punk rock and as a space of rebellion, unquote. Therefore, by employing Crossley's lens of music worlds, I am shedding light on these outskirts because for me, they're so essential. And we've seen in these outskirts, for instance, how El Paso punk did live up to Bobby Walsh's idea of endless possibility, that it was a site of endless possibility, but in particular for women. In the case of one El Paso punk, Marisa Chavez, she stated that these shows in particular, quote, were punk spaces that were the antithesis of machismo culture elsewhere. It was a space where girls could be all punked out, and the girls would be all punked out, but also the guys were, and at least in theory, there was a support for feminism, and it was intended to be anti-capitalist, unquote. But also when we scour these outskirts for the entire networks of the music world, we can also see forms of exclusion, especially for the women of color, even though they were a dominant force in this music community. So for instance, El Paso punk Jessica Flores was a key promoter, especially in the late 90s, early 2000s in El Paso. But she also experienced overt and subtle forms of sexism in her role as a promoter in El Paso. She noted, quote, and it's really hard for girls to be a promoter. I would get people just telling me comments like, oh, this is a really good turnout for a girl promoter. Just stupid shit like that. You know what I mean? And so Luis Mota, started getting most of the shows because he's like a dude, you know. Maybe it was me, and I don't want to do it, but it was probably a mixture of things, a lot of things involved. So really what I've done today is to counter the knee-jerk tendency amongst some journalists and punk scholars, because it continues today, to ignore women, in particular women of color, in punk rock. And not only that, the range of their experiences. You know, I refuse to just say it was just punk rock was completely liberating and empowering, because it was for many, but it wasn't completely exclusive as well. Like there was a combination, right? So when you interview and talk to enough women, you get a range of experiences because we're complex and nuanced people. So from the empowering to the dismissive to the dehumanizing, we see this range of experiences, because if we don't bother to get to those outskirts, then we're back to, quote, the whole John Lennon and Yoko Ono debacle, unquote, according to Lauren Cisneros, no relation to Jenny Cisneros, where the Beatles were able to prosper from Ono's talent. As a basis for the El Paso band Egon, and also a committed music expert in the Chico punk scene, Chico punk music world, Lauren Cisneros is adamant when she states, quote, people need to remember that there were actually females that were part of the music world in El Paso. It's kind of like the whole John and Yoko Ono debacle. In reality, she was able to make them prosper. He took from her. So I always think about that. I always think about how there were girls that were part of the scene, and it was just not about the guys. Like Jenny Cisneros from Spitch, there were amazing females being a part of that. That's what people need to know. Maybe it was not all inclusive as it should have been, but they were there. She adds with a lot of emphasis, we were there, we were part of it. No matter what any guy says or tries to downplay it, we were there, unquote. So really, Cisneros is just channeling the sentiment of the need to focus on women, and not just women, other communities that are part of the music community, meaning not just looking at solo artists that come to our national attention. We need to look at the networks, and women are especially deeply embedded in those networks, especially in El Paso punk rock. And Sarah Reiser knew this needed to come to attention long ago in 1986 when she was writing in her zine Femme Fatale. And it's also a takeaway that if you don't remember anything about this talk, and I'm hoping that you at least remember Jenny Cisneros being awesome and how, because she's an amazing artist. There's just like an overarching theme of what you should remember about these women and any women that are part of any community, music community or music world. She wrote in 1996, quote, our bodies are not our voices or our outlets to the world. Our minds are what matter. Our minds are what you hear. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tara. I wanted to thank Adam Clark as well. I think thank you. I'm excited back into running the show in the back office. So for time for questions and conversation, we're going to start with those who are in the room and then move to our virtual friends on the Zoom. So do people have some questions?
Hi. I love your talk. I love seeing those photos, and I love the music interludes. That was awesome. Your like my sweet spot is in early 90s also. So like I'm very familiar with it. I have a question for you. It's something that I've been thinking about in with respect to other music worlds. And that is, where are they now? So would you mind following up just a little bit with some of the people you mentioned, and kind of I'm curious how maybe, I guess what I'm most hoping to hear is how has their early experience kind of informed their present life?
Yeah, so, no, that's an excellent question. I appreciate it. Thank you. So another woman in punk, Marina Vice, she's very active. She was very active. She started her own radio punk show when she went to university at New Mexico State University of Massachusetts. And she always states that it was not a phase. Like punk ethos are still part of who I am, and you see that throughout. And so let's just say Bobby Welsh, who's still in Paso again, and not only is she still active in the music culture and some more local in some ways, like she works with Sparta and so forth, but she's still a force. But she's also a force politically. So she's on and then she's getting I'm sorry, Bobby. I apologize if I get this wrong. She's on the board of like the cultural board in El Paso. She's on a lot of important political
El Paso International Music Foundation.
Bobby, they got my back and they made sure I have to have the music facts. Thank you. Among many other things, Bobby. So she's very active. I'm just going to give you an example of what Bobby and Marina did in concert, because Marina's more second generation, like 90s, Bobby's everywhere, but she started in the 70s. So in the early 2000s, as you all know, there was a rash of femicides along the Paso Juarez border. And so a key activist who I mentioned here, who came from the punk rock scene, Marisa Chavez, she attended UT Austin, got her degree. She came back to El Paso and she was witnessing this horrible, the massacre of these women along the border. She met Jesus Portillo, who was in a key punk rock band, the Flas, and he was like, "Hey, we should have a concert to raise money to help out in regards to these addressing these femicides." So they connected with Bobby Welsh and Marina and other punk rock bands, and they created an entire festival in 2002 called Festival de la Mujer, or Mujer Fest, where they raised money to support Casa Amiga, which was the only domestic violence shelter in Juarez at the time. And in one interview with Marina Monsiváis, she stated in an interview, quote, "This is just putting our punk rock ethos to work." Unquote. So really like connecting with other punk rock bands. Sparta came off of a tour to play there. Ozomatli came to play for free pretty much. And it was all women like Bobby, like Marina, and other punks that came together to support a bigger effort. But talking about, let's just say, because there's so many, let's just talk about, let's say Erica, or the one that you saw there. She lives in Albuquerque, so she's from New Mexico. She and her partner Ernesto Ibarra, who is also in the scene, are key DJs in Albuquerque. They're like voraciously having like these shows late at night, and then she works full time as a teacher. She DJs, and then she like the other day she texted me. She's like, "Yeah, I'm gonna start another band." I'm like, "Oh, really? How can you sleep?" She's like, "Yeah, I think I want to do like a band that covers Violet Fenn's songs." I was like, "Dang, I see." So all of them are like in some way like shaped by these experiences. Just like for me, it's transformative. You can't come from a music community, even if you're not playing an instrument. And while I definitely respect all those of you who play instruments, you don't need to play an instrument to be part of this community. And I think they felt that, and like they use their organizational acumen to do really good things in their communities. So this gives you a taste, but there's more. Read the book next year and you'll see more.
I have a question. So I might have missed it, but you were talking about a little boy that said, "Here come the Picas."
Oh yeah.
Was that a band, or was that like
Oh,
what
sorry.
they call?
Yeah, that's what you call the punk rockers, the Picas. Sorry. Yeah. She told me that again. I get random texts from her. I'm like, "I'm gonna use that." Yeah. The little nephew were just like, "What did they got the Picas?" So yeah, I would just call it that. I don't know if it was a formal thing. I think it was just a little boy being like, "What are these punks doing?" So yeah. Do you mind if I'm just-
Okay. Yeah. Do any of the El Paso punk rock dudes acknowledge being inspired by some of those house parties, or did they?
Oh yeah. So both the guys, like for the women and the men, like the lower valley. And again, this is the thing about the lower valley is that there's these big backyards. So it was just like the perfect site. But some of the shows oftentimes were in vacant lots, and one of the key people, Alex Martinez, who played with Jenny Cisneros, yeah, he was a punk rock shaman, but along with a lot of these women. So yeah, the Lower Valley shows were really like everybody from the other parts of Paso. Like the best shows were in the Lower Valley, and that's like the Chicano, more working class part of Paso. Yeah, so it was widespread. But after a while, like there was one interview with Angel Turbe, and he was just like, yeah, I love the Lower Valley shows. They were the best. It's just great. And he's like, but then when you're in your 20s, it's kind of not cool to hang out with all these 13-year-olds. So then you have a shift to like more venues. And so many of these people, like Jessica Flores was one of them. She was key in like the more, there was another site that they created, but like she was key to starting to book at official sites like Cantina La Curia, like bars in the early 2000s, even though she was really involved in the kind of like backyard show scene. And then there was also a place they created something like based on Woodman Street called the Rug Burn. And it was just kind of like this community focused punk venue that they did on their own. And Jessica learned a lot of promoting there. Like just like the ropes. It was really her boyfriend that was the promoter, but then she learned those ropes, and then she became a force to be reckoned with in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and like the official places where you can drink and not hang out with 12-year-olds.
So I saw that like you have conducted those 70 interviews in oral histories, which first of all is wondering. But I was wondering about your methodology, how you chose like who to interview, and if you faced any like pushback to certain interviews.
Well, the methodology is really just like a snowball method, because a lot of it's about trust. So it's a key thing about trust. And so since I was in the scene, there were two bands in particular. One band, the Chinese Love Beats, that moved to Albuquerque, and so they were foundational to my scene. So I met a couple of the guys, one guy in particular who would drive me home when I was drinking at our key venue, the Launchpad, and the promoter who was from El Paso, who was Mota, right? And so it was like, it was first, so like reconnecting with them, I reconnected with them on a Facebook group, and Ernesto Ibarra was key to kind of opening it up to people like, yeah, you should trust her. She's down. And then really just anybody would be like, hey, have you talked to my prima? Have you talked to them? Have you talked to that person? So really the methodology, and I don't know if that's really a methodology other than like snowball, because like I just went out after anybody who would talk to me, and especially women. So like when I told them that like I really wanted to focus on women, especially Chicanas, they go, well, yeah, then why don't you talk to Lauren, my wife? And I was like, yeah, I want to talk to your wife, right? So that was really kind of how I focused, because I was just so, I knew it was so important to do. So I was going to try to talk to as many people as possible. And there's actually even more people to talk to. And I have to finish the book, so I don't. And I couldn't use all of those interviews. And then the second part, I might have missed on the second part of your question. I apologize. What was that?
To face any like pushback or
People were open, very loving and very generous. Partly because like there's like punk love and punk community that transcends like geographic boundaries, but I'm also from Cruces. So it's like tri-state, easy tri-state kind of place. The fact that I knew like Ernesto and I knew Mikey Morales probably helped. There's probably pushback in regards to, I sometimes hear that since I'm not from El Paso, why is she writing about it? Even though I'm from like 15 minutes away. Maybe sometimes my focus, like what I focus on, especially in regards to gender, but I don't think like any of us who do anything meaningful is always gonna get pushback, but overwhelmingly, there's just like a lot of love. It's really like, so I just came from El Paso, and it was really hard because I had so many people to see, and they're so embracing, they share so much, almost everything here is from them. So I don't think it's pushed back. Everything, I've been almost like, I feel overwhelmingly embraced.
Anyone more from the room, and then get some Zoomers in?
Just a question for you about choosing El Paso, because you say you're from Doñana, but it sounds like Albuquerque is where you've kind of done it in the punk scene. So what made you go back to look at El Paso?
Yeah, so I was writing about social movements, so my first book was mainly about social movements, right? And then, but I was always interested in the cultural movement parts. And I wrote a chapter on Bad Brains, so it was like challenging the racialized kind of understanding of punk rock, and I was like, but I know it, because like the scene I came from was also predominantly in color. So I started kind of making forays, but really what happened is just like, I love the city. And then I returned to teach in New Mexico, and I was just like, I'm right there. And literally, like, my family loves that city. So it was like a coalescence. It was just like, well, I'm home. It's right there. And I don't know about you all, but there's also something visceral, like, you know, in your gut, like, this is the right time to go down there. And I always have that, especially about people. So I think it was just like the right timing. I knew that I wanted to continue to study cultural movements than just the political side. And I knew that I was just surprised also that there's very little written on El Paso, just on the whole on El Paso, which is like, for my dad and my mom who's from California, they're like, what? This is the best place, right? And so there is a book by a Spaniard. His name's Benjamin Villegas, and it's called El Paso Punk Rock. And it kind of is like bridges fiction with nonfiction, but he mainly focused on like Teenage Popeye and the Rhythm Pigs. But there was no mention of Bobby Welsh, and like there were no women there. And so I knew that there was like a space for me, because I knew I was in Albuquerque, and I knew there were women, especially the women, but I knew there was more to the story. Even though he did a great job, I knew there was space. There was just a necessary, especially a need to create scaffolding, especially for Chicanas, to know that like we're here, even if we're not on the cover of a lot of Rolling Stone, or not the cover of many scholarly works, or sometimes in the cities of even current works of scholars. It's like, if you're not mentioning Alice Fagg, I don't know, I don't want to look at it.
If the mic can pick me up, we might bring in some Zoom questions if some of those participants have some.
Does anybody have any questions on Zoom? I've not gotten any in the chat yet.
Okay, we can also keep track of the room.
I have a question. Can you speak more to that kind of, you talking about the tri-state, the relationship between Las Cruces and El Paso, and just kind of, because El Paso is in such a unique geographic location in Texas. When you think about Texas music and Texas culture, El Paso is so unique in that way. So I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, like that tri-city kind of interaction. And so like this is what I bring into, I think everybody does in their work on music. It's like, this is in the 1990s especially. So there used to be much more fluidity among the three before the border. So just say first part between Juarez and El Paso. So these punks in particular, a punk from Juarez, Edmundo Valencia, and Eric Frescas created, and you can see it in Book Your Own Fucking Life. They'd be like, hey, you come to El Paso, you play one night, crash at my house, and then you play another night in Juarez in a place called Venture's Place, which was like a garage. So you had that fluidity there. And then in regards to Las Cruces, if we just look at Marina, for instance, Marina Motsis Vice, who was a big key community activist in the city today, she was, she paid her dues. So her first semester in mass communications at NMSU, she's like, hey, I want to have a punk show. I want to have a punk rock, radio show. And the guy's like, play country music really early in the morning for an entire semester and you'll get your punk rock show. She played country music really early in the morning. But then she and her cohort, her helper, her co-host Duster, would bring bands, especially bands like the Eyeliners that are from Berlin, Mexico, or other bands like El Paso bands, or just major bands like Fall Out Boy and so forth. They would come, they would have a radio show, and then they would play in El Paso. And so then you would have those kids, those punks, going down to El Paso, or oftentimes like at the drive-in, for instance, would play in backyards in Las Cruces. So there's this kind of like, there's this like fluidity. And I think just at the basis, if you see it culturally, Juarez, Las Cruces, El Paso, like there's just, you just look at them, they're just such a coalescence of culture and so forth. Now it's different because the border's much more militarized and so forth. So those are just two anecdotes that hopefully shed light on what you're kind of aiming at. Oh, yeah.
Hi, maybe a comment as much as anything. I also, I make films about music, made a film about, public music in Africa. And, different circumstances before apartheid, a lot of it. And so many, when we went to go cover it, so many of the women were just photographers and journalists, and they just really weren't in the scene. And I screened the film recently. It's our biggest regret is that we tried as hard as we could to incorporate more women into the film. It just wasn't really there. We're making a film right now in the DC punk scene, size in Central Europe, and just try not to make that mistake again, or trying to approach it in a better way. And just looking back and going through a lot of the issues you're going through of, these early punk scenes were multiracial, and women were a part of it, and the queer scene was a part of it. It was very much for everyone. It was about fairness. It's kind of a guiding light, and so often these groups get pushed out. And so, I appreciate you talk a lot, and even in the UK bands like the Raincoats and Slits, they were great bands, but they were still quite marginalized. And even in the DC scene, someone like Amy Pickering, where some of these people who were key to it, trying to include those people. And I'm just, you talk about it some, but it sounds like maybe in El Paso these lady punks were much more a part of the scene than maybe in other places, or was it really quite marginalized?
It's just like it was like a complex state. So I think to address I don't know if I could really compare, because I don't know how. There's been there's a recent book called Empire. It's on 90s punk. So like Punk and the Triumphant Empire or something like that. And that guy does a really good job. I think his name's David Pearson. I'm pretty sure David Pearson. And so he's talking about 90s punk rock. And he's also a musicologist. And so he does all this like stuff that I don't understand regarding like notes and all that. But he does make a concerted effort. So he talks to Michelle Gonzalez from Spit Boy. He interviews Martin Plugo, from like the Pilsen, Chicago, Latinx punk bands. So I don't know, because the thing is like I don't think our scope has been broad enough for me to really compare. Like I said, there's like one really good book I think on Los Angeles that was Michelle Bayan, and she's exclusively focused on Latinx punk, and then the women were there. So I think a lot of it's like it's really hard to compare, because I don't know if we've really got beyond like there's Joey Ramone and there's like Henry Rollins, when it's like but then there's always them. And then the second point in regards to like filmmaking, cultural production is really important here. And so I didn't learn about the Raincoats until later, and I didn't learn about Alice Five until later. And so what I think of is like my niece is super punk, and she's being raised in Pilsen, which is like this is where like Latinx hardcore came in. This is where Martin Plugo's from. It's a really Mexicanized neighborhood, and my family ended up moving there, which is perfect. And so my niece is like, she's not aware of it, she's all super punk rock. She needs to read, eventually she'll read her like Lynn Diaz's book, and then she'll be like, she has the scaffolding, like, yeah, and see, like, I have a place here. So like the more and more that we repeat it, and not just women, people of color, women of color, where it's constantly like, no, they're white guys, so I think that's also the key thing about cultural production and scholarly production, so that we know that we're creating kind of a reference point for the next generation, that like we do belong, like this is ours, punk is ours, just as much as it's anybody else's.
I just want to feedback on that. I reviewed a book some years back that was all on the Right Girl Proceeding. And one of my big problems with the book, and I know that people, the woman who wrote it, and so I know the one first, but so one of my problems with it was that it's sort of natural, I think probably in music history generally, to sort of be oriented towards the musician to the people playing music. And there's lots of social reasons why those tend to be met, right? Because that aggression, loudness, access to money, access to free time where you're not having to do the housework, the dishes, the laundry for your family. No, you don't have babysitting duties, right? You have a car of your own and you have the freedom of mobility. There's a lot of reasons why guys are getting good at music and able to get instruments at the time and all this stuff that a lot of women, younger women in their teens in particular, have never been told, yes, play that music loud, right? Here's a guitar, right? Here's a car, right? Yes, go out by yourself with like 5 random dudes and like go to a show 50 minutes away, right? This is not what girls tend to be like. Girls are supported in like creating that themselves at a young age. And by the time many girls, I think, get to be in their early 20s when they're in college or something, they feel like it's too late, right? And that's a sad thing because of course it's not too late, but like there's not. I think that like what you're saying, looking at people who are promoting and booking shows, that's really important. Thinking about like stuff like recording, DJing, right? Getting your punk show. I had a punk show during college on the radio, right? Like I put together like festivals, right? Big shows, right? So all this was stuff that I believe I could do as a woman when I hadn't been given a guitar.
Yeah. I think it's also, particularly, this is exclusive to punk, so I can't talk to the key music cultures, but I think the point you're talking about, especially in regards to space, is essential. So a handful of the women I talked to skateboarded. And so it's like skateboarding is intertwined inextricably with punk rock. And so I look at my own personal trajectory. I skateboarded until like 12 or 13. And then all of a sudden, like the dynamics were different. Like I wasn't like one of the bros, even though I felt like a bro, like I'm a little bro. But I'm like, I'm not a bro, because all of a sudden you turn into like, well, if you still hang out with them, still you're a skate slut. And then I just started to get into academics too, right? But there were gals that skateboarded. And so I think that's one of the key pipelines into punk rock is like you're hanging with your homies. And then like you start talking, well, it's just like start a band. And some of these bands started just because they were skateboarding around the Lower Valley. And Alex Martinez is like, hey, come in here, play a show. Hey, we have a band. We have a band, and then they have a band, right? So I think that like I would really like to explore that kind of pipeline into punk rock, but I think it is also again, I never played an instrument, but there's also just like the broader gender socialization, because with a lot of interviewees, like these are my rock stars, especially the women, like they get all giddy, they probably see it, they're like, gosh, that's embarrassing. But whatever they're doing, whether it's promoting or they did play events, and like, do you know how cool that is? Because that's awesome. And so more often than not, and this is when I get frustrated, I was just doing this. Like, oh no, I was really not that good. I was like, did you hear that loud? You must have much. Right? And you're pretty good. Or maybe they weren't, but it's punk rock. Right? Isn't it supposed to be about inclusivity and so forth? So I think it's broader senses, like just like gendered socialization, and then there's racialized and ethnic parts of like how we're like ingesting symbolic violence that like we can't do it, whether or not our parents are encouraging us to play in a band or promote. None of those things that I could, well, I've done those things, right? So I think it connects to that space and just like broader socialization that hopefully we can change, right? Because that's the power that we have with our words and our scholarship, is to be like, well, Wally Walsh did it, Lindy Hernandez did it, they're still doing it, like, heck, why am I not doing it?
Can I ask one more? Did you, in your research, I'm just curious, did you identify or come across any like sort of catastrophic or end of era moments? In other words, like why something changed, let's say, for women in punk rock from 80s and 90s, like for example, in San Antonio, there was a place called Taco Land, and so when the proprietor was murdered in 2005, it killed, it kind of, there was a distinct change. I was just wondering if you came across any moments where you see that music world that you're researching take a turn or morph into something else because of some other outside force.
I think Well, I'll just focus on the 90s. So, and it's not just like, so the first one is just like to the music world as a whole. So when it was really spearheaded by Alex Martinez, but when Hernandez was involved with it, and others, where they create this, the Rubber, which is called, it's kind of like the Gilman Street, right? Punk-owned kind of venue. There was a riot. Literally, it wasn't a riot, like, it's kind of controversial, but one of the punks thought somebody was causing some trouble at the show, and then the police came and descended upon this punk rock show, and then the police started abusing the punks, especially Alex Martinez got beat pretty badly by the Paso Police Department, and the Rubber shut down, and that seems to be a pivot point, even though that was a unifying point, because that was created to bring the punks throughout El Paso, because there's a lot of the southeast part of the Lower Valley versus the west side. Like the west side is more affluent. This is where like Bethel, O'Rourke, and Jim Ward and others come from, and it's viewed as more affluent, even though it's not entirely, because there's pockets of poverty. And the Lower Valley is like super Chicano, super working class, and so forth. And so it was seen as like a unifying point. But then the tragedy that I talked about in regards to Laura Beard and Sarah Reiser, again, was kind of a unifying point, because by that time the two West Side and Lower Valley scenes had come together, and so they mourned it together, even though they had these rivalries, and so kind of we'll say things about one another, just like flipping, nothing like serious, right? But so I wouldn't say that. Like I have nothing like that, like into that kind of. So like the big momentous tragedy would probably most likely be what happened with the two from Rome and so forth. Yeah, because in many ways it was like a unifying moment, and it's just not a great unifying moment though. Sometimes because you lose these two great musicians and singers.
Well, I thought that was, I didn't know very much about El Paso punk scene in the 90s, but I remember hearing about the release of their record and kind of the story behind it. And I mean, thinking back now, at that time, this is before these bigger bands are coming out of El Paso. At that time, it was probably a lot of people's first connection to that scene, because a lot of people in Austin knew people that were involved, and the word just kind of traveled. And it was like, oh, I had no idea, and that's
like what happened to Sarah and Laura.
And then that album, Driving.
Yeah, and that's a great album. Again, like I love Out the Drive-In. I love Sparta. I think they're great, and I think that song is really, really beautiful. But I think what happens is that, like with that case, and again, while I love that song, is like, and then sometimes we need journalistic accounts of what happens in 1987. Like they get defined by their death, and that's what I wanted to push beyond, because they were really vital. And when I was talking to Lindy on, I think we were talking on Sunday, she's like, well, Tara, like we still say that, like we would talk like they're still alive. Like she's like, we weren't doing this. I was like, well, people like me and other journalists were doing it, and I want to try to like counter that, because that's what often happens. Like women are like in these footnotes, and other marginalized groups, but in this case I'm talking about women, we get like these little footnotes, if at all, especially in like journalistic or scholarly accounts of music communities. Like, well, like, oh, she did a good job. And it's almost like condescending. Yeah, that's great, but let's focus on the serious work, right? And I wanted to show that like they were super ahead of their time. They were vibrant. They were engaged. They are, right? These are gals that I wanted to hang out with, and that's why I feel very lucky that I get to hang out with the Bobby Welshes, the Lindy Nunes's, the Erica Ortegones, because like they are, and they're still vibrant. And it's just trying to kind of like counter that point, even though it's really important. And it's hard when you're an outsider, if you're learning about it just from that venue. So the Kents, like in addition to Napoleon Solo, which is a beautiful song, now like there's this vitality behind it.
Let me be clear. I didn't learn about this.
Oh, no.
We got to drive it. I remember there.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I don't want to get that private.
No, excuse me, the example. No, I get it. Yeah, because there's so many bands. Like there's Stitch, so many bands like moved out to Austin and so forth. And I focus on Stitch because Jen was great, and I did invite her, but she's very humble. And she's like, well, thanks, I appreciate it, but I'm gonna take a vacation, and she's a hardworking woman, so good for her, right? But she's still, I don't know if she's in any bands right now. I don't know.
We're coming up against time. I know that we're happy to continue the conversations informally one-on-one. But I want to thank all of you again for coming, and thanks especially to Sarah Lopez for sharing these stories with us. Thank you.